So what can I, as a classicist, tell you about the market? Well, for a start, not just the word market, but merchandise, merchant, commerce, trade, even money. All of those words are ultimately Latin and given to us by the Romans. Now, I only have 15 minutes, and you will see I claim to be able to talk about trade, politics, and culture in the Roman Empire, spanning 13 centuries, the great majority of Europe, all of the North African coast, and a big slice of Asia. Spoiler alert, that is not going to be doable. But we like challenges here in Engelsberg, and I'm going to do my best. Before I kick off, there are two difficulties that confront us when we're trying to reconstruct the reality of the Roman Empire. The first is the top-down attempt of ideas dreamt up in Rome, imposed upon the entire imperial territory. A lot of those simply didn't land on the ground. So there's the theory, but it doesn't match up with the practice. The second problem is that Rome became an empire by virtue of conquest, and the various peoples conquered had hugely different modes of trade, modes of industry, modes of economy. And those systems still survive to a decent degree all the way through the Roman Empire. So we've got a mismatch of Roman ideals and the reality on the ground. The second difficulty is one of lack of evidence, because it is simply a fact of the passage of time that most of the things we would want to analyze have disappeared. So we have plenty of literature, millions of words surviving in Latin, but accounts and bills and numbers, the sort of stuff that is the bread and butter for an economist, has gone. What is more, the markets, the stalls, the very physical places in which trade occurred are largely ruined. As to the goods traded, they were mostly consumable and perishable, and within days or weeks or years or centuries, they have disappeared too. So it doesn't look good in terms of a search for evidence for me to say anything. But it's not all bad news, because deep under the sands of Egypt, papyri do survive, including loads of accounts. Right up near Hadrian's Wall, near the English-Scottish border, tablets and letters written by soldiers on the fringes of empire survive. And indeed, something as spectacular as a volcanic eruption paused, froze in a moment of time, a normal day in a normal town of Pompeii. So we have surviving just in Pompeii 600 shops in the state they were on that fateful day in 79 AD. Furthermore, shipwrecks are good news for us because they preserve the commerce on the seabed. Similarly, other items that may be lost or somehow carbonized by a volcano can give us information. The spread of coins around the empire, the spread of pot shards baked in different parts of the empire can also open up doors for us. Finally, there are some literary texts, legal and agricultural texts, which give us a good steer as to how trade was. So although a lot is speculative and the subject of intense debate, there is a huge wealth of evidence that can inform us about the reality of ancient trade. So since all roads lead there, I will begin in Rome. And you might think that I would begin in the most famous open civic space for trade, the Forum. Forum just means outdoor place, and it's true that the Roman Forum was in origin the place for Roman trade. But if we go back 2,000 years to AD 24 and we immerse ourselves in the Roman Forum, we're not going to learn a lot about trade. The reason is by this point the space has become gentrified and politicized. It's surrounded by temples, by political buildings, by statues and other monuments, and there's very little active trade going on. Bit of financing, bit of upmarket selling, but the day-to-day trade is elsewhere. Where? Well, Rome is on such a scale at this point that each market has its own market. There's the Forum Boarium for cattle, leather, and milk. There's the Forum Suarium for pork, the Forum Holitorium for vegetables and fruit, the Forum Vinarium for wine, the Forum Pistorium for bread, the Forum Piscatorium for fish. You get the idea. Every sector of trade has its own physical forum. So I don't want to begin in any of those fora because we can understand what they were like. Instead, the best place for me to start is a little south of the Forum at a place called Monte Testaccio. And as it sounds, that is a mountain, but it's not one of the 7 hills of Rome. It is, in fact, a gigantic rubbish heap. 5 acres in area, 40 meters high, and made solely of fragments of olive oil amphorae. And more than that, those amphorae are stamped with their point of origin. And almost all of them come from the province of Baetica in southern Spain, 1,000 miles across the Mediterranean. Almost all of them are from the 2nd century AD, and there are 50 million of them. Each amphora contains 70 litres of oil, and we estimate that this one pile of shards for one product contained 3 to 4 billion litres of olive oil. So here's the scale of trade going on in Rome. A day-to-day substance like olive oil is travelling across almost the whole Mediterranean, or half of it, for a Roman audience, despite the fact that in Italy there's loads of olive oil. What is going on? Well, that is the titanic scale of Roman trade. So we need to say a few words about how Rome got here. Founded legendarily in the 8th century by Romulus and Remus with the help of a female wolf, things were slow in growth. But by the 3rd century BC, Rome had edged out the 2 major players in the Mediterranean, the Greeks and the Phoenicians. The Carthaginians, across in modern Tunisia, were a major trading and military power, and there were 3 huge wars with the Carthaginians in the 3rd and 2nd century BC. But come 146 BC, a major year for Rome, both Greece and Carthage are defeated. And the original plan, interestingly enough, was simply for Carthage to move off the Mediterranean coast so that it couldn't be a maritime power. It can survive, but it can't be a rival trade. In fact, the advice of Cato the Elder prevailed. Carthago delenda est. Carthage had to be destroyed, and indeed it was destroyed entirely. So come 146 BC, Rome is calling itself Caput Mundi, the head of the world, and it's calling the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea. We are in charge. So is it the case that thereafter free trade thrives, capitalism in a proto-form comes to the fore, and all is fine and dandy? Not quite. Because problems are emerging in Rome, and it's essential to sketch the politics of those if we're going to understand the Roman economy. For the Roman, farming was the best thing to do. To be a self-sufficient farmer who didn't need to trade, wasn't greedy about making a surplus, but just lived a simple life on land he owned. That is the Roman ideal. Cicero says himself that there's no more delightful and indeed no more befitting life for a free man than farming. However, the reality of the expansion of the Roman Empire as it conquered Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, Gaul, and beyond is that huge amounts of land are being conquered. Theoretically, that land is to become owned by the Roman state, but what was happening in practice is that wealthy Romans were leasing or purchasing huge new estates. What's more, they weren't getting local farmers, local peasants to work the land. There was a huge influx of slaves from the expansion of the empire. So suddenly the top tier of Romans are massive landowners with huge profit margins because most of the workers are slaves who obviously are not paid and cannot be free. As a result, the great majority of Romans are peasant farmers who are now undercut and cannot make a living. So they literally flee into the city of Rome. And it's for that reason only that Rome becomes the first city in history to have a population of over 1 million. But that population is not sustainable. For a start, Rome is a city, so there's no farms inside it. And the area around Rome is not well disposed to large-scale farming. Furthermore, those wealthy landowners I mentioned, they've moved into olive oil and wine rather than grain because it makes more money. So there are several reasons why there simply isn't the grain available to feed the people of Rome. Well, come the 2nd century BC, this really does become a life or death matter. We've got a starving populace, and we've got a new brand of populist leader trying to speak up for the common man, the everyman, rather than the elites. And you may have heard of the brothers Gracchi, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. What's so important about them is that they end up being killed by fellow elite Romans because they want to fix the situation by getting the land back from the wealthy landowners, limiting them to 125 acres, and distributing the rest to the poor so that they can go out of Rome and be small-scale farmers, as was the original dream. Well, both of those are executed for such radical politics. So we have a problem in Rome. The peasantry stay there, the plebs, as they're called, they can't be fed, and there's no obvious solution. We'll come back to that problem soon. What about trade elsewhere? How's it working? We have the daily markets, as I mentioned, the various fora, but the working week in the Roman world was on an 8-day cycle. Every 8th day, the so-called nundini, was a full-scale market day. There was no work, there was no political business, the elites weren't allowed to transact any trades, and people travelled into Rome for market day. Strange that it was an 8-day cycle. The 7-day idea comes in from the East a few centuries later. In each of those different markets, the tradesmen are part of a collegium, a college or a corporation, looking out for their mutual interests. So they're sort of self-policing. But higher above them, there are 4 magistrates who control all of the things you need for a fully functioning economy. They check the standards of weights and measures, they close down any illegal markets, and they help the wheels of trade turn peacefully. But the reality of the ancient world is that travel over land is unbelievably more expensive than travel by sea. We think it's either 50 or up to 70 times more expensive to move the same goods by road than by sea. As such, we are dealing with a maritime economy. Rome is on the Tiber, it has the big port Ostia, and commerce is dragged into Rome by water. And we've got the 2 extremes of maritime trade going on here. We've got your staples, grain, oil, wine, papyrus, which is the main material for documents, of course, salted fish, whatever it may be, traveling on huge scale, as well as luxury goods coming into Europe as far afield as from India and Sri Lanka, where Rome traded directly, and indirectly from China. We don't think the Romans and Chinese were trading head-to-head, as it were. So it seems as though Rome, as a consuming city, not a city of production, is thriving. What about all the rest of the empire? It's a fair question. There's 50 million people. They are buying from Rome when they're opting in to try and Romanize themselves as the elite did, but also they have to buy from Rome and they have to produce trade because otherwise they can't pay their taxes. So trade is enforced by the Romans through their system of taxation. But I'm going to end with 2 problems to the free trade dream here. The first goes back to the hungry populace in Rome. Grain was 75% of the diet of the normal Roman. They needed something like 60,000 tons of grain a year to give away for free or for a tiny price. And the only way to fund that grain supply was to use all of North Africa as the breadbasket, specifically of Rome. So there's state control of the grain supply, specifically for Rome, throughout the empire. The second and final problem is the army. The army, at its maximal scale, has 500,000 soldiers spread, obviously, at the frontiers of the whole empire. How do they get their goods? The fact is, the private sector can't handle the amount of food, the amount of wine, the amount of armor they need. So Rome builds 250,000 miles of private roads, only to be used by the Roman state in order to keep its army afloat. And by virtue of that, the little economies spread throughout the empire are held back and closed from free trade. So that is a whistle-stop sketch of what the Roman Empire looked like, the degree to which it worked, and in many senses, the degree to which it did not and ended up in collapse. So, thank you very much.
David, just a question.
Of course.
Who were the merchants and what was their social status?
Excellent question. So the Romans, because at the elite level they admired farming alone, they thought trade was beneath them. So they thought foreigners, poor people, or slaves were the only people to engage in retail and day-to-day trade. But behind the scenes, although they were not allowed to trade themselves, they used middlemen, so-called negotiatores, to do deals for them, and they traded, as it were, under the radar at a huge scale. So those in day-to-day trade were sub-elite, and those who were mostly buying in markets were women and slaves.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.